Part 1. The descent begins. The world above is quiet now. The last sounds of the village, the distant hooves of a horse, the rustle of wind through autumn trees, the muted hum of voices fading into the evening have fallen away. You stand at the edge of something older than silence itself. Before you, an arched doorway, carved roughly from stone, yawns open. There are no guards here, no flickering torches, just the scent of moisture and time. This is not a place for judgment, not a place for spectacle. This is a medieval dungeon. And tonight, gently, slowly, we'll walk down into it. Together, you may imagine that it begins with a grand gate, or a drawbridge, but no. The entrance is unassuming, almost hidden, as if even the architects of the castle wished to forget it existed. The walls are damp and cool to the touch. They breathe in the night air like old lungs. Ivy has crept between cracks in the stone, as though nature itself is trying to seal the place shut. One step down, then another staircase spirals, uneven and narrow, worn smooth by centuries of boots and bare feet. Your own footsteps make a dull, padded sound, muffled by moss and dust. There are no windows, no birdsong, just the occasional soft drip of water echoing from somewhere below, like a quiet clock marking forgotten hours. It's easy to lose track of time here, easy to forget whether it's day or night. In the Middle Ages, that confusion was often the point. You descend further. The air changes cooler now, denser, tinged with iron and old wood. There's the faint, earthy smell of mold, and something else, subtler, ash, maybe, or the dry rot of things long dead. The scent clings to the stone and settles in the back of the throat. Not sharp, but lingering. Medieval dungeons were not necessarily places of torture, at least, not in the theatrical sense we sometimes imagine. There were no glowing fires or shrieking interrogations in every castle corner. Instead, punishment came in quieter ways, slower, more patient, a starvation of senses, a removal of the world. You pass a torch bracket, long empty. The walls around it are blackened, not by fire, but by the oils of countless fingers brushing past. The torchlight has long since died, but the memory of heat remains, like the shadow of a dream. Eventually, you reach a corridor that widens. Slightly a long hall, arches curve overhead, just enough to give the impression of a ceiling. There are doors here, wooden, iron-bound, each one slightly different. Some have tiny grates, no bigger than a palm. Others are sealed completely. And beyond those doors, stillness. In these early dungeons, especially those built beneath monasteries or keeps, imprisonment wasn't always about cruelty. Sometimes, it was penance, solitude, a time to reflect. But time, in these conditions, has a strange shape. Think of the darkness. Not the kind your eyes adjust to. Not a bedroom with the lights off. This was full, saturating dark. Without a window, without a flame, there was no up or down, no shadow or form. It was the kind of darkness that folds into the mind and begins. To live there, a prisoner might be placed in such a cell for days, or years, and no one would hear them. You walk slowly past one of the doors. The iron latch is rusted, but intact. Through a slit in the wood, no larger than your fist, you glimpse only blackness. The floor below your feet is worn stone, uneven, stained, in places, with memories you cannot name. Somewhere, behind another door, you hear a tiny sound, not loud, not clear, just a shift, as though the walls are remembering someone. In medieval records, dungeons were sometimes called oubliettes. The word comes from the French oubliette, to forget. To place someone there was to make them disappear, and often, that was exactly the purpose. Unlike modern prisons, these were not centers of rehabilitation or even formal punishment. They were holes, places between justice and memory. You were not there to await trial. You were there because no one wished to deal with you anymore. Perhaps it was political. Perhaps it was superstition. Perhaps no one remembered why you were there at all. The chill in the air deepens. You take another breath. Cold, still, and damp. No smell of firewood here. No perfume of herbs or meals. Just the soft, living odor of earth that has never seen the sun. And now, as you reach the end of the corridor, you see an alcove to the left. A small space carved into the wall, just enough for one person to curl into. There are scratch marks here, barely visible. Not letters, not messages, just lines. 5 together, then a gap, then 5 more, a counting of days. Or perhaps simply a way to remember that time still moved. The deeper we walk into this world, the more fragile the human body feels. Not because of torture devices or shackles, though we'll speak of those, gently, in time, but because of the slow erosion of everything a body needs. Light, warmth, air, hope. You sit for a moment on the cold stone bench near the final door. It's worn into a shallow dip, molded by others who once waited here. Your hand rests on the wall, fingertips tracing grooves you cannot explain. They're old, much older than the mortar that surrounds them. Perhaps decorative, perhaps accidental, or perhaps just someone trying to pass the time. You listen, nothing, and yet, your mind fills in the silence. A cough, a whisper, a dragging chain. But there is no one here, not anymore, only stories, and stone, and now you. Part 2. The air that would not let you sleep. You've remained still for a while now, long enough for the cold to find the layers beneath your skin. It's not the sharp cold of winter, nor the dry chill of mountain wind. It is a damp, creeping, cold one that seeps into the hollows of your body, like mist through a crack in a cellar wall. Above ground, air moves. It dances, even when it's still shifting through trees, flowing through homes, stirred by footsteps and breath. But down here, in the belly of ancient stone, the air does not move. It settles, it thickens, and in time, it begins to press. Inward, not in weight, but in presence. You inhale again. The breath is not fresh. It holds a stillness that makes you want to cough, not because of dust or smoke, but because it feels old. It smells of mildew and wet stone, a hint of something rusty, something forgotten. It is not unpleasant, but it reminds you that what you're breathing has circled through this space many times, through tunnels, through cracks, through centuries. In the medieval period, dungeon architects did not design for airflow. Ventilation was not a priority. Many dungeons had no windows at all, and even those with openings, high on the walls or carved into ceilings, often faced stone courtyards, spaces without wind or sun. What happened to the air? Then, when it had nowhere to go, it thickened with the scent of living bodies, with the sharpness of fierce sweat, with the tints of unwashed skin, with the odors of waste and rot and leather. If the dungeon held many prisoners, the smell would compound daily until it was not just a scent, but a texture, a curtain that clung to hair and clothing. Visitors sometimes recoiled, covering their faces, but the prisoners, they became part of it, or it became part of them. There is a strange kind of forgetting that happens in such a space. The body begins to let go of what it cannot have: sunlight, fresh breeze, the warmth of a fire. You might think your lungs would adapt, and to some degree, they would. But the longer a person remained, the more likely their breathing became shallow. Less out of panic, more out of quiet surrender. Medieval physicians didn't understand oxygen, or bacteria, or the respiratory system as we know it today. But they observed. They noted that prisoners often grew pale, lethargic, confused. Some believed this was divine punishment. Others called it the dungeon sickness, a phrase that meant little, but carried weight in town whispers. You move. Now slowly, toward one of the old barred windows, no larger than a bread loaf, set 6 feet above the floor. If you stretch, you can place your fingertips against the stone ledge. The opening faces another wall, just a few feet beyond. No sky, no wind, just a distant patch of lichen growing in the filtered light. It would not be enough. Not for a prisoner. Hoping for something more than air that tasted of stone and secrets, even the fires used by guards or cooks, far above, did little to change the atmosphere here. Smoke might drift down, but warmth did not. And in the winter, the cold air would grow, heavy, settling, like water into every joint, every bone. Frost might form along the stones, glittering in the dark like breath made solid. The irony is, dungeons were often part of the castle's defensive brilliance. They were built thick and low, immune to siege fire, hidden from arrows, stable even under attack. But that same brilliance created a space that was nearly unlivable for anyone kept within. Like a trap designed not to kill, but to forget to release. Let us turn now to sound. Or rather, the absence of it. With air so still, every sound becomes something else. Your own breathing sounds louder. Your heartbeat, closer. A single drop of water from an unseen ceiling becomes a metronome for the hours. Many medieval prisoners spoke of hearing voices, not divine, not monstrous, but strangely human. Footsteps that never approached. Conversations just out of reach. Today, we might call it sensory deprivation. Then, it was called madness, and it often came not with violence, but with the quiet rustle of nothingness stretching too long. You sit again, this time beneath the tiny window. The stone here is slightly warmer, as if the sun once touched it long ago. You place a hand against the wall, tracing its cool surface, and wonder how many others sat here. Doing the same. There are writings from the period, letters, poems, even diary fragments, that speak of this strange space between breath and burden. A 14th prisoner once wrote, "The air does not sing here. It presses upon me, as though the night itself were holding its breath." It is not often quoted in textbooks, but it feels right, doesn't it? Let us pause a moment here. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Listen to the room you're in, the real room, not the imagined cell. Perhaps there's the faint hum of a fan, the breath of your own lungs, the rustle of bedsheets. And yet, do you feel how close the medieval world suddenly seems? Not in its violence, not in its laws, but in its silences, its stone, its stillness. This is not meant to frighten you, only to remind you that to survive such a place, you would have needed more than food, or strength, or cunning. You would have needed breath, but not just the kind that fills lungs. You would have needed living air, moving air, the kind that carries the scent of wheat fields, or a bakery, the kind that stirs your hair on a spring morning, the kind that makes you forget you are breathing at all. And here, in the dungeon, there was no such thing, of course. Here's Part 3. The meal that wasn't familiar, still sitting on the stone floor. The scent of old earth lingering in your breath. The silence here is thick, but not cruel. It invites you to listen more deeply to things you wouldn't notice. Above ground, your stomach growls. A quiet sound, easily missed. But in a medieval dungeon, hunger wasn't something you could ignore. It was a companion, always there, always whispering. Tonight, we shift gently toward what passed for sustenance in the bowels of ancient stone. But don't worry, this won't be gruesome. We won't dwell on pain or revulsion. Instead, we'll explore the simple, sobering truth that food, in these places, was never about nourishment. It was about time, and waiting, and learning how little the body needs before it begins to forget what it once had. Imagine the rhythm of meals, or rather, the absence of rhythm. In modern life, meals come with structure. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. In the dungeon, there was no clock, no calendar. There might be one delivery a day, maybe two, or sometimes none at all. What arrived was not a plate, but a portion. Bread, mostly, not the kind you'd slice and toast, but hard, round, dark loaves, often made from rye, barley, or acorn flour. Dense and coarse, speckled with grains or husks, and sometimes a little mold. But mold was not always considered a flaw. It meant the bread was softening, easier to chew, less likely to break teeth. And teeth, in these conditions, were precious. Water, if given, came in wooden bowls or metal cups, often murky, drawn from cisterns or runoff barrels. Occasionally, in wealthier prisons, a flask of thin ale might be provided. Not as a treat, but because ale was sometimes cleaner than the water. You glance around the cell. There is no table, no bench. Food would be pushed through a small gap in the door, if such a door existed. Some cells had a tiny sliding hatch at floor level. The meal would arrive with a scraping sound, then silence. No conversation, no warning. If you were asleep when it came, and you missed it, well, hunger became the next day's companion. 2. What happens to the body when it is underfed? For days, weeks, months, it grows quiet. At first, there is protest, cramps, fatigue, tremors, but slowly, something else takes over, a kind of muted patience. Muscles soften, thoughts slow. You begin to forget the richness of flavor, the texture of hot soup or sweet fruit. Even smell becomes dulled in these damp corridors. When you are surrounded by mildew, rust, and human breath, the scent of food, if it comes at all, is more memory than experience. There are old records from 13th century monasteries, which kept careful notes about provisions for prisoners. In one such entry, it is written, 2 crusts, 1 cup of brew, enough to hold the body, not to light the spirit. And that was on a good day. In some dungeons, especially those not officially maintained, prisoners relied on family or friends from the outside to bring food. A small basket, lowered on a rope, a hidden bundle passed through a grating. But such kindness required permission, and permission required favor, or money, or both. If no one came, you waited, you hoped, or you bartered. Bartering in the dungeon was its own quiet economy. If a prisoner had anything, a comb, a button, a scrap of cloth, it might be traded for a crust of bread from someone else. In some cases, songs were traded. A man with a voice could offer lullabies for a few bites. A woman who remembered prayers might recite them in exchange for warmth or food. Even silence could be a currency. If you don't call out when the guard comes, someone might say, "I'll save you a piece of bread." You begin to understand now. Food was never just food. It was a moment of control in a world that offered none. And then, there were the rats. You may think of them as vermin, and they were, but they were also informants. Their presence meant there was food nearby. Their scurrying signaled that something edible had arrived, even if you couldn't yet smell it. Sometimes, prisoners left crumbs deliberately not to feed the rats, but to track time. If the rats came earlier today than yesterday, perhaps the food delivery would come sooner. Of course, in darker corners of history, there are rumors of worse, of prisoners eating leather, of scraping mold from the walls and licking moisture from moss, of chewing on straw bedding just to remember the motion of eating. But we won't dwell there tonight, because even in these places, there was a strange kind of grace, a ritual, a sacredness to receiving something, anything, from the outside world. To sit cross-legged on a stone floor, holding a crust of bread as if it were gold. To sip water from a dented tin and close your eyes, pretending it was wine. To share, sometimes, with a neighbor you couldn't see, slipping half a loaf under the wall, just for the feeling of having something to give. This too was survival, not of the body, necessarily, but of the soul, of dignity, of remembering that you were still someone, not just something locked behind stone. Tonight, as you lie in your bed, you may notice how quiet the room feels, how soft your blanket is, how clean the water in your glass appears, if you have one nearby. These things are small, overlooked, perhaps, but they are what the dungeon denied. The meal wasn't a meal, not in the way we understand it. It was a thread, a whisper from the world above. Proof that you were still real, even in the dark, and sometimes, that was enough. Sometimes, it had to be. Part 4. When time lost its shape, you lie still now, surrounded by stone that does not speak. The air is still, the hunger is quiet for now, and all that remains is time. But not the kind of time you know, above ground. Time is marked by sound and light, a rooster's crow, the warmth of the sun climbing through the window, the clang of iron on a blacksmith's anvil. Even the changing color of the sky tells you where in the day you are. But down here, in the depths of the medieval dungeon, those rhythms vanish. And when the rhythms are gone, time becomes something else entirely. At first, you may try to count, you may mark the stone walls with your fingernail or a chip of broken pottery. 5 lines, then a cross, again and again. But soon you'll wonder, did I already mark this day? Was it today I counted last, or yesterday? In many cells, there is no light, not even a torch. And even those dungeons that offered a narrow slit of sun would provide no reliable rhythm. The sun might shine in once a day, or not at all. If clouds hung overhead, or the slot faced the wrong direction, there were no clocks, no bells to chime the hour. There was only your breath, your heartbeat, and the slow crawl of thoughts. Some prisoners began to measure time by sound, a guard's footsteps in the corridor, the squeak of a bucket being pulled up from the well, the shifting sigh of another inmate rolling over on the floor beyond the wall. But even these things were not guaranteed, and so time began to blur to modern minds. This may seem like a poetic idea, the dissolving of time, but it was far from romantic. It was disorienting. There are records from monks who were once confined for penance. They described the days as being without doors or ends. One wrote, "I slept and awoke, but I know not how many times. My dreams returned before I could leave them. I spoke aloud to hear myself, but the echo did not answer." Time, in the dungeon, was not a rope pulling you forward. It was a pool, still deep, measured. Imagine the effect this has on the body. The human body depends on cycles, circadian rhythms, the gentle dance between sunlight and shadow. That tells us when to wake, when to rest, when to dream. Without those cues, the body tries to guess. It drifts. You might feel drowsy when you should be alert, restless when it's time to sleep. Some prisoners spoke of feeling they had been there a week, only to learn it had been 2 days. Others believed they had been inside a few days, only to be told it had been years. What is memory? When there is nothing new to remember, you begin to recall the same dreams, again and again. A forest, a voice, a warm kitchen, not because they mean something but because they are the only threads left to hold on to. Even pain, even hunger, becomes a kind of anchor, a way to know you are still moving through something. You shift your position on the floor. The stone is not comfortable, but it is familiar now. You could map the pattern of cracks in it with your fingertips. You know the shape of the wall where a small patch of lichen grows. You know the sound of your own breath echoing back at you, slower, deeper now. In some dungeons, the guards were instructed to prevent prisoners from knowing the time. They would vary the feeding schedule, or move the torches randomly. It was not considered torture, not in the records. Anyway, it was simply policy, part of the confinement. They believed that when a person lost their grip on time, they softened, they stopped fighting, they stopped hoping. They became, in a sense, timeless, easier to manage. But still, the mind resists. Prisoners would invent rituals, a stretch, a prayer, a tapping of the toe. They might name the stones on the wall, not out of madness, but out of instinct. To create a rhythm, a pulse, a sense of now, and dreams. Dreams grew powerful. You may not know this, but dreams inside dungeon cells were often described with vivid detail in the letters of monks, scribes, and nobles who had once been confined. One monk wrote of dreaming that he had returned to his childhood home and counted every knot in the wood of the ceiling beams. Another claimed he could smell his mother's soup, the garlic, the herbs, more clearly in the dream than he ever had in waking life. These dreams were not fantasies. They were memories, returning with new colors. Because when time dissolves, the mind becomes a theater, and even the faintest past becomes a companion. You rise now, slowly, your back stiff, your legs unsure. There is no sunrise here to greet you, no morning bell, but something in your body tells you, another cycle has passed. You do not know how many. And so, you walk the perimeter of your small cell, not to escape, but to feel the movement of time again. 5 steps one way, 4 steps back. Touch the wall, tap the floor, whisper a name. It does not matter whose. It matters only that the ritual remains. This is how the mind survives what the body cannot define. And now, we return to the present, to your room, wherever you are. Perhaps the air is still, perhaps a fan hums gently nearby. Perhaps there is a clock ticking on the wall, or the sound of a distant car. These are your rhythms, your reminders that time moves forward, minute by minute, morning to night. Let this bring you peace. Let it wrap around you like a familiar blanket, because in the dungeon there were no clocks, no songs, no sunrise. Only the soft, slow erosion of shape. Only the waiting. Part 5. The tools that never had to cute. You've grown used to the stillness now, the breathless hush of the stones, the soft weight of silence. But somewhere, beyond this corridor, behind a wooden door warped by centuries of damp and waiting, rests a room that was once not so quiet. Tonight, we visit that room, not to disturb the peace, but to understand what fear could become. Even when no blade was drawn, let us begin not with torture but with the threat of it. In popular imagination, medieval dungeons were always filled with screams and shackles, fires and whips. But more often than not, the most powerful instrument of pain was imagination itself. The body could resist much, but the mind, when isolated, when starved of time and comfort, was vulnerable to suggestion. You might be led down a hallway, told nothing. The guards say little, they rarely need to. You enter a chamber, cooler than the others. Wide-arched, the walls are stone, yes, but marked differently. Scorched in places, grooved in others, and on the walls, hanging like ghosts in iron skin, are tools. Some are instantly recognizable chains, cuffs, heavy collars of iron. Others are strange, curious, unlabeled, and unspoken. There are racks, with cranks, chairs studded with iron points, long bars with twisted mechanisms at the end. You may not know what they are, but your mind fills in the spaces. That was often enough. In many cases, the tools were never used. They were shown, displayed, left in plain sight during questioning. Sometimes, the accused would be seated in the chamber with nothing but silence. Just the tools, the torchlight, and the sound of their own breath. And slowly, they would speak. Not always the truth, but something. Let us speak now of a few of these objects, gently, quietly, not to frighten, but to observe what they meant. The rack, for instance, a large frame, wooden and crude, with rollers at each end. The prisoner's wrists and ankles would be bound, and the handles turned. It was not the pain that often caused confession, but the anticipation, the knowledge that every breath might be followed by a stretch. Just a little more. Always a little more. Records show that some dungeons kept the rack as a symbol, only cobwebbed, unmaintained, but still effective. It reminded all who saw it that their bodies were not their own here. Then there was the scavenger's daughter, a metal frame that compressed rather than stretched, folding the body in on itself. Far less known than its famous cousin, the Iron Maiden, which, historians now suggest, may not have existed at all during the medieval period. Yes, strange, isn't it? The most iconic instrument of medieval torture, likely a myth, or, more precisely, an invention of later centuries, born from fascination rather than fact. Real or not, its image endured. Sharp iron spikes inside a human-shaped chamber, a door that shut with intention. It was never needed in the dungeon. The idea of it was enough. Now, look around the chamber again. There is a stool, low to the ground, not a device, just a seat. Yet in this room, even the ordinary becomes something else, a place to wait, to watch, to wonder what might be asked, and what might be demanded in return. Some dungeons had water basins, not for drinking, for immersion, a method to simulate drowning, or sometimes simply to shiver the body with cold. Again, not always used, but always present. And presence, here, was its own kind of pressure. One particularly chilling tool was not made of iron or rope, but of parchment. The written confession, a blank page laid before the accused, quill and ink nearby, guards silent, tools behind, no words exchanged, only time and suggestion. Many confessions, it is believed, were written not because they were true, but because the silence was louder than truth. Now, let us return to sound. Imagine hearing the creak of a wheel turning behind the wall, not seeing it, only hearing it, then nothing, then footsteps, then quiet again. In such a space, fear does not need fire. It does not need screams, it only needs possibility. That was the true cruelty of the dungeon, not constant pain, but the waiting, the knowing. The wondering. Would today be the day the door opened? Would the chains be used? Would the guards speak? Or would it all remain in silence, a silence sharpened by presence? And then, some prisoners returned to their cells, untouched, unharmed. No marks upon them, but forever changed, because their minds had wandered through corridors darker than the stones. The philosopher, Boethius, imprisoned in the 6th century, once wrote from his own cell, "The body remains whole, but the soul wanders corners the feet cannot reach." He was never tortured, in the physical sense, and yet, he felt broken by the space around him. Let us pause now. You are lying in warmth. Your hands are your own. The air is kind. There are no tools, no iron, no echoing rooms filled with unspoken purpose. And yet, you've walked with me through them. Slowly, safely. You've seen how silence can be shaped, how fear is often carved from things left untouched, and you've understood, gently, why survival was never about just endurance. It was about the mind, the breath, the soul, held in stillness. Certainly, here is why you wouldn't survive in a medieval dungeon. Part 6. The law wasn't what you think. You awaken, not suddenly, but as one rises from deep water. The memory of iron tools fades like a dream you're grateful to forget. But now, a different kind of shadow waits at the door of our story. Not the shadow of stone or silence, but the shadow of judgment. Tonight, we step softly into the medieval world of law. Not modern law, with lawyers, codes, and evidence, but a law shaped by whispers, rituals, and the shifting will of heaven and earth. Let us begin, not with crime, but with accusation. In many medieval towns, it didn't take much. You could be accused because a neighbor envied your land, because you were seen walking alone at dusk, because milk curdled, or a baby grew sick, or the harvest failed. People needed reasons for suffering, and when no reason could be seen, one was made. Sometimes, you were accused in the square, your name called aloud. Other times, it happened in the dark, a secret message delivered to a steward, a noble, or a priest. And from there, the process began, not swiftly, not cleanly, but with the slow turning of wheels no one could stop. Imagine a knock at your door before sunrise. A man in a dark cloak. No questions, no answers. Only, you are summoned. You might not even know the charge. Once brought to the castle or city hold, the world changed. No longer were you a neighbor, or a merchant, or a widow. You were the accused stand. That meant the dungeon. But we will not return to the cell just yet. Let us remain in the cold hallway of judgment. In medieval courts, evidence was rarely what we know it as today. There were no fingerprints, no written testimonies beyond the clergy or nobles. Most trials relied on oaths, witnesses, and what was called ordeal. Have you heard of it? The ordeal was a ritual, not a test in the modern sense. It was believed that divine power would reveal guilt or innocence, not through facts, but through signs. There were different types. Ordeal by fire. The accused would hold a heated iron ore, place their hand into flame. Then, the wound would be wrapped for 3 days. If it festered, they were guilty. If it healed cleanly, they were declared innocent. But infection knows no belief, and many innocent hands swelled with fever. Ordeal by water. A person was tied and lowered into a river. If they sank, they were innocent, the water accepting them. If they floated, they were guilty, the water rejecting their soul. But breath does not wait for justice. In rare cases, there was trial by combat, especially for nobles. A duel would decide who was right, on the assumption that God would protect the righteous. But as we both know, strength is not always truth. You might think these things were rare, but they were not. They were law. Or rather, the shape law took in a world ruled by unseen forces. And then there were the Inquisitions, formal procedures by church or crown. Long, patient interviews. The accused sat while scribes recorded every word, not in their language, but in Latin, a tongue many could not read. The scribe's quill moved slowly. Sometimes truth made it onto the page. Other times, whatever was needed. In some places, torture was used, not to punish, but to extract. The confessions that followed were accepted as fact. Even if the accused recanted later, the first words, the ones spoken through fear or fog, remained. And for many, the process never even reached a verdict. They were simply held. Weeks, months, years, until they were forgotten. Let us pause now, and turn our gaze from the records to the rooms. In many dungeons, there were no courtrooms nearby. Justice happened elsewhere. The cell was not where innocence was found. It was where waiting was done. That there are stories of people who came to the dungeon expecting questions, expecting the chance to speak. But no one came, no one asked. They waited. Sometimes a letter arrived, a verdict, a pardon, or nothing. The silence became the law. The waiting became the punishment. Now imagine yourself again in that cell. You don't know what you've been accused of. You don't know who spoke against you. You don't know when, or if, you will be brought before anyone. And so, your thoughts turn inward. You try to remember every step of the day they took you. You wonder if someone saw something, or imagined something. You try to calculate. Did you float? Did the iron burn you too deeply? You think of a face in the crowd, a friend, a rival, a priest. You wonder, was it them? And then, worst of all, you wonder, was it me? Because in a world where justice moves, through rumor and wind, even the innocent begin to ask if guilt might be hiding somewhere inside them. The poet, Thomas Hocklove, who lived in the 15th century, once wrote, "There was no gavel, only breath, no scales, only shadows, and I did not know which I had stepped into law or dream." These words survive in a half-forgotten manuscript in an old archive, but they feel close, don't they? Because what he described is not fear of punishment, but fear of not being seen, not being heard, not being believed, and that, perhaps, was the hardest part of all. Now, come back to this moment. Breathe slowly. No one is watching you. No doors will open in the dark. No cold parchment waits for your signature. Here, in your room, there is no dungeon. Only the quiet, soft space of rest. Let that truth wrap around you like a warm blanket. Let your heart ease, knowing that your story is not written by rumor or flame. Let sleep come gently. And if it doesn't, stay with me. We'll keep walking together. Certainly, here is why you wouldn't survive in a medieval dungeon. Part 7. The words they left behind. Some things cannot be silenced, not even by stone. You may recall the heavy doors, the flickering torchlight, the long corridors swallowed by quiet. And yet, Even in these depths, where no birds sang and no sunlight passed, something endured, not the body, not always hope, but words. Tonight, we listen, not with our ears, for the voices we seek are long faded, but with a quiet kind of attention. A listening that happens in the heart, because even in the most forgotten dungeons of the medieval world, people left behind traces of who they were, not always in writing, not always in ink, but in scratches, in murmurs, in breath made visible through memory. Let us begin with the walls. In many medieval prisons, especially those within castles or monasteries, prisoners etched marks onto stone, not as art, but as survival. Some were tally marks, simple rows of lines, a desperate attempt to track the days. Others were names, Elise, G, Benedictus. Some were prayers, in manus tuas, Domini, into your hands, O Lord. A few remarkably were poems, short, verses carved with nail tips or scraps of bone. Not always elegant, but always human. One such verse, found in a 14th century cell in York Castle, reads, "Cold are the stones that hear my weeping. God above, are you not keeping count of tears? In Shadowcast, I was a man. I am the past." We do not know his name, but his words remain. In some places, prisoners sang. Yes, sang. There are records from monastery prisons where monks, confined for doctrinal disagreements, sang psalms aloud at dusk, not in defiance, but in rhythm, to remember who they were, to call to one another through the walls. Imagine it now, the soft rising of voices in Latin, weaving through cracks in the stone, not loud, not joyful, but steady, like a heartbeat. Psalmus, Centesimus, Decimus, Octavus, Psalm 118, a favorite. The word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Some of those who left behind words weren't monks at all. They were mothers, soldiers, cooks, shepherds, people caught in the wrong place, or the wrong faith, or the wrong moment. In a French prison dating to the 1200s, there exists a piece of parchment brittle now written in a rough, unsteady hand. The script is Old French, difficult to translate precisely, but scholars believe it says, "Tell Jean I forgave her. The bread was warm. I dreamed of the pear tree. My fingers ache. I am afraid. But I remember the way she laughed." This was not testimony, not a confession. It was simply a message, folded once, hidden under a stone, found centuries later by accident. Sometimes the only way to remain human was to speak, even if no one answered, to declare yourself in a place designed to erase you. There were also codes, symbols scratched in, corners, spirals, stars, crosses, made backward. Some believed these were magical protections. Others say they were charms against madness, like small spells whispered to yourself in the dark. And then there were the guards. Yes, even some of them wrote. Not all were cruel. Not all were faceless. In the margins of prisoner ledgers, little notes were sometimes added. She wept for her son. His wounds look worse today. Asked again for the psalm. Small things, but enough to remind us that even in systems built on silence, the individual sometimes whispered back. Now, let us pause. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Breathe in, gently. You are surrounded now by more than just stone and shadows. You are surrounded by stories, by names and phrases and songs that once echoed softly through iron bars. The dungeon could steal many things, but it could not silence the wish to be remembered, to speak, to say, "I was here, I thought, I loved, I hoped," even when hope was foolish, even when there was no one listening. A historian once said that prisons are made to forget people, but the people, somehow, always remember themselves. And so they wrote, not for justice, not for protest, but for memory. Even when writing meant scratching at the wall until your nails bled, even when your fingers shook, even when the torchlight flickered and the guard might return at any moment. Somewhere, someone wrote, "I loved the wind, I missed the river, I did not do this. I am sorry, I forgive you." So many endings. And now, you rest. The air in your room is calm, no stone presses into your spine. No torchlight burns. You are not forgotten, you are not unseen. Your name would not be scratched into a wall to prove it was real. You carry it, and that, too, is a kind of freedom. Let the voices of those past drift gently away. Not lost, only softened. Let sleep come. Let memory rest. Certainly, here is the closing chapter of your gentle, sleep-friendly historical journey, why you wouldn't survive in a medieval dungeon. Part 8. The exit is quiet. The journey through these cold corridors is nearly over. We've stepped through iron doors and into cells, where time lost its shape. We've listened to silence sharpened by suggestion, watched justice blur through ritual, and heard the faint, stubborn voices of those who refused to disappear. But now, it is time to leave, not with noise, not with drama, just gently. Because the truth is, most people did not leave the dungeon with clarity. They left changed, or broken, or silenced. And some, as you know, never left at all. So as we open this final door, let's walk slowly. Let's Pay attention to the light, how it softens the rough edges of the stone, how the air begins to feel just a little warmer on the skin. Imagine your steps are real now, not imagined, not suspended in dream, but returning, quietly. And yet, the memory remains. In the medieval world, dungeons weren't always underground. Some were towers, some were simple locked rooms, and not all were brutal. Some held nobles, allowed visitors, even writing materials, but others were places where the soul had to grow its own light. One 15th century prisoner, a scribe accused of heresy, left behind a tiny prayer, scratched in Latin, into a cell wall. It reads, Domini, si non exio, faq, manium, in te. Lord, if I do not leave, let me remain in you. A sentence like a whisper like a light that somehow outlived the dungeon itself, because that's what happens. In time, the walls fall, the chains rust, but the quiet, the waiting, the words, the small rituals of survival, they remain in memory. In poems, in carvings, in stories like this one. And now that you've listened, truly listened, you carry some of those fragments. 2. Not as a burden, but as a kind of understanding. You may be wondering, was this history meant to frighten? No, not here. This story, it was never about fear, it was about soft remembering. The kind of history that lingers not through facts, but through feeling. Because history isn't always written in books. Sometimes it's felt in the body, the way your shoulders tense imagining stone beneath you, or how your breath slows as the torchlight flickers in your mind. These sensations are how the past speaks, not in data, but in echoes. And so, we close the door now. We climb, slowly, back into the rhythm of our own world. You are not in a cell. You are not forgotten. You are not waiting for judgment. You are here wrapped in fabric, cradled by air, listening to a story that has no sharp edges. If you are still awake, let this be the moment you let go. Let the images fade like mist. Let the stone walls dissolve into memory. You are not meant to survive a medieval dungeon, not because you are weak, but because you are no longer shaped for a world so silent, so indifferent. You are shaped for softness, for warmth, for stories that end in peace. And if, by some chance, you dream tonight of corridors or candlelight, know that they are only dreams, and you may walk through them freely. No doors will close behind you. No voice will call your name, only the hush of understanding will remain. Like dust stirred by a passing breath, you have listened, now you may rest.